Okay, the Ramban lays down a very important rule in understanding everything in Chumash Bereshis. It's a very, very famous klal. It's called Maisa Avai Siman Labanim, that whatever happens in the lives of the patriarchs is a sign regarding what's going to happen to the Jewish people in the future. So as a result, what happens to Avraham is going to happen to us on some level, Yitzchak, Yaakov, all of those different things. So for example, Avraham going down to Mitzrayim and then leaving Mitzrayim with great wealth is a remez to our Yitzias Mitzrayim. We'll be in Mitzrayim, we'll come out with great wealth. We find the idea of Yitzchak digging wells, and Yitzchak dug, or his servants dug 2 groups of wells, and they got filled up by the Philistines. And then the third well did not get filled up. That's a remez that the Beis HaMikdash, which is called a source of living water, is going to be destroyed twice, and then there will be a third Beis HaMikdash. Even the teaching that Yishmael did tshuva, right? Chazal teach us that before Avraham died, after Sarah died, so Yishmael did tshuva, came back to Avraham, and even Hagar got recreated as a woman keturah, and keturah is from the word incense. Her deeds were as pleasant as incense. So we find Yishmael did tshuva, Hagar did tshuva. So the Meshech Chochmah says that's a remez, that bi'acharis hayamim, the descendants of Yishmael, the Arabs, are going to do a tshuva process as well. Now the Meshech Chochmah says the first stage in the tshuva of Bnei Yishmael goes very, very far back. It was their conversion to Islam. Even though we don't look at that necessarily as something so positive, but again, the pre-Mohammed Arabs were pagans, and Islam was a step in the direction of monotheism, and that's already the beginning of a process that will bring Bnei Yishmael to a state of tshuva. And I would suggest that the second stage is things like the Abraham Accords, in which the Emirates and Dubai, etc., are making overtures, even Saudi Arabia. Again, to some degree, people say that the October 7th Hamas thing was precisely a way of trying to derail the peace overtures that were happening within the Arab world. And now, I don't want to get too political, but now that the one who actually pushed the Abraham Accords, Trump, is back in office, perhaps, B'ezras Hashem, that process is going to continue. So even though it's side by side with Hamas, Hezbollah, and who knows what's going on in Syria, on one hand, you can be very, very happy that we got rid of Assad, or Assad is no longer there. Assad was a very brutal dictator even to his own people. But, who's replacing him might even be worse. So who knows? But on the other hand, there's a certain vacuum there, and the vacuum might be filled in positive ways. And maybe this too is a process of Yishmael doing tshuva. Who knows? Maybe even Iran. Maybe Syria will be a precedent for Iran overthrowing. So all of this is Maisa Avai Siman Labanim. What you see in the Chumash by the Avais is kind of a sign of what is going to happen to their descendants. So as a result, Parshas Vayishlach had a special importance to Chazal, because Parshas Vayishlach is the encounter that Yaakov has with Esau after more than 20 years of absence. Yaakov is finally coming back to Eretz Yisrael. And he sends a message to his brother Esau saying, hey, I'm coming back, and Baruch Hashem, God has blessed me. And he gets back a response. Esau is coming with 400 soldiers. And it's the encounter of the Jewish people with the great, great powers that try to destroy us in various ways. And since Chazal had a tradition, although it's hard to trace it, that the Romans are descended from Esau. So they saw in the encounter of Yaakov and Esau a way that the Jewish people should deal with the hostile government of Rome. We were ruled by the Romans for more than 200 years, and in many, many ways, all of Western civilization is still called the exile of Edom. We are still called in the Edomite exile, even though there's no Roman Empire, but either Rome is the Rome got it from Greece, but Rome was the transmitter of Western civilization to Europe. And of course, Rome also became the seat of Christianity or Catholicism, which was the dominant power against the Jews throughout history, more than Islam. Islam is now bi'achirit hayamim, having a certain ascendancy. So as a result, the technical name of the Golos that we're in is the Golos of Edom, right? There are 4 exiles, not counting Mitzrayim, which is the prototype. We have the exile of Babylonia, Bavel. We have Persia. We have Greece, where the Chanukah story took place. And we have the exile of Rome. And we are still in the exile of Rome because they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, and we haven't gotten it back. Although the Midrashim say that the end stages of the exile of Rome will be combined with an exile from Yishmael, which is kind of the persecution from the Arabs. So given the fact that Parshas Vayishlach is the encounter of Yaakov Avinu with Esau, Chazal saw this as the encounter of the Jewish nation with the Romans, with Edom. And as a result, Rav Yehuda Hanasi would study whenever he had to meet with Roman officials over various issues. He would study the lessons of Vayishlach and derive certain strategies for how you deal with the, enemy occupier, so to speak. So first of all, though, let me just raise a very interesting question. Should Yaakov have contacted Esau at all? Meaning, it's an interesting question. The way the Chumash describes it is, Yaakov on his own just decides to send a message to Esau, describing his possessions, describing his success, and notifying Esau that he's coming back in the country. Now, obviously, Yaakov was hoping to get a positive response. Instead, he gets back a response that Esau still hates you, and Esau wants to kill you. So an interesting question is, maybe Yaakov made a mistake. There are midrashim that actually suggest that Yaakov shouldn't have told Esau anything at all. He should have just showed up in Eretz Israel. Esau was not living there. Esau was living in the area called Mount Seir, which is south. Esau was not even living in Eretz Israel proper. And perhaps Yaakov shouldn't have boasted, so to speak, about his resources. The Medrash applies a very interesting pasuk in Mishlei. The pasuk in Mishlei says, Machzik biozne kelev, over misaber al riv lo lo. He who gets involved in a quarrel that he didn't have to get involved in is like pulling the ears of a sleeping dog. Okay, dogs sleep, right? Dogs like to sleep. So sometimes people think it's cute if you pull the dogs up by the ears, or the big floppy ears. Well, what happens even if it's a Labrador Retriever, even if it's the most gentle dog, you pull a dog by its ears, it's going to bite you, more or less, because that's it hurts and it's an act of aggression. So Chazal compare Yaakov initiating a relationship with Esau as pulling the ears of a sleeping dog. And it would have been better for Yaakov just to not say anything, just do what he's doing. Esau might not even find out, or whatever it is. So that's an interesting question. Other Mefarshim do take the approach that it's appropriate, it's a matter of courtesy, a matter of derech eretz, that Yaakov legitimately thought this was a way of making amends. Okay. But be it as it may, whether the initial contact was good or the initial contact was bad, once he makes the contact, he's faced with a threat. Esau is threatening him with 400 soldiers. So Yaakov has 3 strategies to deal with the threat. Number 1, he sends gifts and flattery. Right? He says, "You're my servant." He calls Esau his master. He refers to himself as your servant. Later, when he meets Esau, people bow down to Esau. So that's one way of doing it. You flatter the person, you build them up, you make concessions to them. But then Yaakov had a plan B. That's milchama. That if it's necessary, we're going to fight. We're going to fight. And that's going to be necessary as well. And the third strategy, which is necessary for the other 2, is tefillah, to pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he should give you success. So these are the 3 strategies. In other words, on one hand, you try to be conciliatory, You try to make peace. You try to make concessions when you're able to make concessions. But you also have to back it up with the willingness to fight for your survival of either your physical person or primarily for the Torah, right? The whole war of Chanukah is a war in order to keep the Torah, right? It's not the war of Chanukah was not about political independence. It turned into political independence, but it was a war in defense of the Torah. And ultimately, without Hashem's prayer, you're not gonna have any success. Now, I just want to say that based on the idea of Maisa Avasim and Labanim, these three strategies are not only relevant in Yaakov's encounter with Esau, and it's not only relevant to the Jewish people and Rome, but it may apply in a more general sense. And that is, what is our relationship to secular culture generally? Right? There's a lot of wisdom out there. There's science, there's philosophy, there's literature, technology. Right? Technology is a very big issue. Like, what is the Torah's approach to technology, to social media, to internet, to smartphones? Right? Here in Eretz Yisrael, you get the impression, maybe in the yeshiva world, that having a smartphone is much, much worse than converting to Christianity. It's like the biggest aveira you could possibly do. Okay, I'm not going to express my opinion on it, although I think maybe I did already. But anyway, but how do I deal with that? Now, there are two philosophies towards how a Ben Torah deals with a secular world. One philosophy is you keep as far from it as you can, meaning anything that's not in the Beis Medrash, anything that is not sourced in Torah literature, I consider to be treif, I consider to be invalid. I don't want anything to do with it because it's going to poison me and my family. That's approach number one. Metaphorically, we could describe that as waging war against that chachma. Waging war against that culture. I don't want it. Now, in truth, even those who wage absolute war, the war is never absolute. After all, they have telephones. Everybody has a telephone. Even if you don't have a smartphone, you have a dumb phone. But you have a phone or a landline or whatever it is. So to simply say, I don't want anything that's not rooted in Torah is simply not real. But whatever it is, the idea of milchama is I want to distance myself from secular culture as much as I possibly can. We'll call that the milchama approach. Then there's an opposite approach, where a person says, I want to be open to as much as I can. I want to be a religious Jew. We're talking about people who want to be religious. I want to be a religious Jew, but I still want to be exposed to the culture, to the wisdom, to the insight, to all of the learning that was brought into the world over thousands and thousands of years. Now, indeed, Chazal seem to have endorsed the legitimacy of some of that wisdom, because there's a famous medrash in Eicha that says that if somebody says to you, Chachma Bagoyim, there is wisdom among the nations, Tamin, believe them. If they say there's something as great as Torah among the nations, you don't believe them. But Chachma Bagoyim, Tamin, Chachma Bagoyim, Tamin. So we'll call that gift giving. In other words, what I'm doing metaphorically is, Yaakov had three strategies. Yaakov had milchama, Yaakov had doron, which is gift giving, conciliatory overtures, and then tefillah. So we might suggest milchama is the idea of rejecting the outside world. Gift giving, which is conciliation and coming together, is accepting the outside world. Now you see from the fact that Yaakov incorporated both, that this is not an either or an all or nothing type of choice. Our response to the world out there should not be total rejection, and it should not be total acceptance. But there needs to be a wisdom to be able to understand what is good and noble and elevating and useful, and or useful, versus what is degrading and what is decadent. Now, it's always the case that it's much easier to live your life in black and white. One says, I either reject everything, if it's not in the Beis Medrash, I don't want it, or I want to participate in everything out there. Right? Those are relatively easy modalities to go with, because black or white, right? Chocolate or vanilla. But what Yaakov Avinu is teaching us is that a person needs to be discriminating, because the truth of the matter is either extreme is bad, although I will admit if I had to make a binary choice between total acceptance and total rejection, I do think total rejection is better than total acceptance, because total acceptance is going to poison you for sure. Total rejection may leave you ignorant and a little defective in certain areas, but at least the core of you will still be connected to Hashem. But the point is, both of them are distortions. The total rejection attitude means that you're not going to gain from the legitimate wisdom and insight of the Umot HaOlam over thousands of years. Total acceptance means you'll be corrupted and dragged down into the morass of what popular culture and society has become. So Yaakov Avinu is telling us, you got to be able to discriminate. Discrimination is very, very difficult. What is good? What is bad? What is legitimate? What is not legitimate? Now, this is a decision you have to make for yourself, and certainly when, God willing, you become parents, you're going to have to, think about, how am I going to raise my kids? Right? So what Yaakov is teaching us is that in our confrontation with the outside world, we have to adopt both a milchama modality and a conciliatory modality. And above all, you pray to Hashem for the wisdom, tefillah, to know what to accept and what to reject. Because it's not easy. It's not easy. It's a challenge all the time. You don't want to stifle a person. You have a child. You don't want to stifle them. You don't want to limit them. You want to give them opportunity to explore all of the chachmas in the world. There are many, many chachmas, science, literature, even philosophy within bounds can enrich a person, expand a person. But at the same time, it's like playing with fire or playing with nuclear energy. Tremendously beneficial. But potentially, if it falls into the wrong hands, or it's used in the wrong way, it's destructive. You need guidance from Hashem. You need wisdom. And that's a difficult thing. That's why sometimes, as a practical matter, just as a practical matter, we might advocate that you need several years in which you're not so connected to that outside world. Those are yeshiva years, in which you're building up your inner reserves of Torah. And then you're able to go out and selectively incorporate. In other words, when you're fortified inside, you're then able to confront a challenging world. Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, we say Havdalah on wine, of course, but before we say Havdalah on wine, we actually recite a Havdalah in the Amidah, in the Shemona Esrei itself. In fact, it's interesting, just to give you the role of the two Havdalahs. As soon as you recite the Havdalah in the Amidah, or even if before Ma'ariv, if you say the words Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'cho, and Shabbos is already over, you are allowed to do work. So when I finish Shemona Esrei, Motzei Shabbos, and I said the Atachan Antanu paragraph, I'm allowed to turn on a light. In fact, that's how you light the Havdalah candle. You're allowed to do that. But you're not allowed to eat or drink until you hear the Havdalah over wine. Except for water. You are allowed to have water before Havdalah. But that's all you can have before Havdalah. Okay. Now, the Atachan Antanu paragraph, which is called the Havdalah of prayer, what bracha of the Amidah does that paragraph appear in? It actually appears in the fourth bracha of the Amidah, which is the bracha asking Hashem for wisdom and understanding. So the question is, why is it inserted there? Why is the bracha of Havdalah between Kodesh and Chol inserted in a bracha that is asking God for wisdom, discernment, and understanding? So the Gemara explains, because without wisdom, you're not able to separate between good and bad. It takes wisdom to separate from good or bad. Meaning, without wisdom, I could either say everything's bad, or I can say everything's good, vis-a-vis the outside culture. But it is wisdom that gives me the capacity of discernment. I'm sorry. It is, that's right. Yeah, wisdom, discernment, meaning the ability to differentiate between holiness, right? So that I think is an important lesson. And this is actually very relevant to Chanukah. I'll tell you why. You know, one of the things you're going to be hearing many, many times from me and from other people is that the war against the Greeks was not just a military war, it was a war of culture. That Judaism represented Torah, Kedusha, obedience to God, submission to morality. And the Greek culture elevated man to be the highest of all beings, whether it's the athleticism of the human body or the philosophy or the literature, whatever it would be. In other words, Greece had a religion of many, many gods, but that was, the Torah says we were made in God's image. The Greek gods, small g gods, are gods made in man's image. I mean, they're just like human beings who are superheroes. And by the way, they weren't that concerned with morality either. I mean, basically, the Greek gods, Zeus or whatever, these were, degenerate thugs who happened to have superpowers. I mean, full of rape and murder and incest and everything else. So they were not models of good moral behavior. So the Greek culture generally was focused on the greatness of man, what man can achieve, as opposed to Judaism that was focused on submission to God, and therefore the light of Chanukah dispels the darkness of Greece. And that's going to be a theme you're going to hear in different ways over and over and over again. But the truth of the matter is it is more complicated, because it's not simply Judaism is good, Greece is bad. Yavan is descended from Yefes. Yefes is Noach's second son. Right? Noach had three sons, third son rather, Shem, Ham, and Yefes. Yefes' son was called Yavan. Yavan is Greece. The founder of the Greek nation came from Yefes. Now, if you remember the story, after the Mabul, Noach was despondent at seeing an empty, desolate, destroyed world. So Noach planted a vineyard. Noach got drunk. Again, psychologically, this is not such a complicated issue. If you imagine a world that was destroyed by nuclear war and you're like the last survivor, you might get drunk. I mean, basically, what am I going to do in this world? And Noach gets drunk, and apparently he got exposed. Some nakedness got exposed. And Ham, at a minimum, Ham saw the nakedness and he wanted his brothers to look at it. Chazal make it much more sinister. Some say he actually castrated his father. Okay, but let's just go to the simple meaning of the verse. He sees his father's nakedness. He calls his brothers, hey, come and see this. And both Shem and Yefes take a blanket. They drape it over their shoulders. They walk backwards to cover up their father. So their father should not be humiliated or shamed. So Noach gave a bracha to Yefes. And listen to this bracha. Yaft Elokim liyefes. It's a pun, right? Yefes is yafeh, beauty. Yaft, God shall give beauty to Yefes. In Hebrew it's a pun. Yaft Elokim liyefes. V'yishkain, and he will dwell, be ohalei Shem, in the tents of Shem. Now in English that sounds bad, the tents of Shem, but remember, Shem is a Hebrew name. So dwelling in the tents of Shem is a positive statement, not a negative statement. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch who a great German rabbi who lived in the 19th century, who indeed created a school of thought trying to combine Torah with the cultures of the world, said the following. Chum is kind of the bad son. Chum became the Canaanites. No, those are not the worthy people that are doing anything positive in the world. But Shem and Yefes were given two missions, both of which are needed and both of which are complementary. Shem was given the mission of godliness, holiness, spirituality, morality. They were to be the beacon of light. Of course, Shem's descendant eventually was Avram Avinu and the Jewish people. In fact, that's why we're called Semites. Semites comes from Shem. We are, right? So in a sense, the Arabs are also Semites, right? The Shem, right? So Shem has the mission of godliness. Yefes has the mission of creating aesthetics and beauty in the world. And it did that through Yavan, just as Shem's mission was accomplished through Avram. Yefes's mission was accomplished through Yavan. Yavan introduced tremendous beauty on all levels in the world, whether it's the beauty of human athleticism, the beauty of sculpture, the beauty of painting, the beauty of music, the beauty of poetry, the beauty of philosophy, formal philosophy and mathematics. Again, if any of you had bad experiences with calculus in high school, maybe one does not look at mathematics as a thing of beauty, but indeed, talk to any mathematician. They will describe mathematics in actually aesthetic terms, the beauty of the symmetry, the beauty of the logic. Logic is beautiful. There's a beauty. So, Shem has the mission of godliness. Yavan, Yefes, has the vision of beauty. Now let's look at Noach's blessing. Yafta Lakim Yefes, I hereby confer beauty on Yefes. V'yishkain, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. So Rav Hirsch is masber the following. Yefes's beauty is truly beautiful, but only when it is subordinated to the ethical values and belief in God of Shem. When it dwells in the tent of Shem, then it becomes beautiful. But when it separates from the tents of Shem and becomes a human worship of the greatness of man, divorced from morality and from ethics and monotheism and godliness, then it becomes destructive. So, there are two implications in Vayishkain B'alei Shem. One is, Yefes's beauty is beautiful only when it links itself to godliness. Okay, that's point one. Point two is that it's a message to Shem, that Shem should invite and incorporate the beauty of Yefes into its tent. So it's both a message to Yefes and a message to Shem. The message to Yefes is, all of your great culture is worthless and destructive unless you subordinate yourself to the values of godliness and Kedusha. That's the message to Yefes. The message to Shem is, bring it into your tent. So, based on this, the war of Chanukah is a little bit more complicated, because it isn't simply, let's destroy Yavan, but rather, let's have the seichel to know what to incorporate and what to reject. So it is a war against Yavan, but it's a war against the Yavan that wasn't dwelling in the tents of Shem. But we still got to figure out, what can I bring in? You see? In fact, that might explain why, halachically, there is such an emphasis on beauty in the mitzvah of Chanukah. Like Chazal tell us, there are three ways you can fulfill the mitzvah of Chanukah lights. There is basic, there is enhanced, and then there's super duper enhanced. Basic is very surprising. You'd be very surprised. I've never met a person who did the mitzvah the basic way. That's simply lighting one candle every night. So even if my family are 10 people, I light one candle, no, not counting the shamash, I light one candle day one, night one, and I light one candle night 8. One candle every single night. That's basic. So if you're stuck, you can actually do that, and you can make brachas on it. Now, then it mentions there's mahadrin. There's a more beautiful way of doing it, and that's still not our way. And that is, I light one candle for every member of my family. Meaning, if I have 10 people, including myself, the middle level, which is not what we do yet, is I light 10 candles night one, and every night, and even the 8th night, I light 10 candles. Now, but then there's a higher level. Mahadrin, sounds like a restaurant. Mahadrin mina mahadrin, the highest of the highest. And there, you light according to the days of Chanukah, and that's the famous machlokas, which we'll talk about later, between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, where Beit Shammai says you start with 8 and you go down, and Beit Hillel says you start with 1 and you go up. And this we, of course, paskin like Beit Hillel. But it's interesting to know. I mean, everybody who lights Chanukah candles does this. Even if a person is totally non-observant, except for Chanukah, they don't say, "Oh, I'm just going to do the basic." They light according to the number of days, even though that's not a chiyuv. That's just mahadrin min ha-mahadrin. So why is there such an emphasis on beauty in the Chanukah ritual? So there are a lot of different answers on this, but just connected to the theme we're talking about today, that's because what you're doing is you're incorporating Yefes into the tent of shame, because Yefes represents beauty. So we don't reject beauty. We're not like the Taliban, right? The Taliban went and they smashed all of this, beautiful ancient architecture that went back 1,000 years. No, we say, take the beauty and incorporate it. So the true victory over Yavan is not to destroy what Yavan represented, but to capture it, sublimate it, channel it into good and positive directions, right? So that's a little bit of a change in how we view because you're going to hear speech after speech after speech about how bad Yavan is, and Yavan is modern culture, etc., and we got to destroy it and get rid of it, and there's truth in that, of course, but there's actually a more subtle process of incorporating it and elevating it. Now, 2 more points I want to make. After Yaakov, sends his message to Esau, so Yaakov then said, the Torah says, Vayira Yaakov ma'od. Yaakov was very afraid. Vayetzar lo, and he was distressed. So Rashi comments, based on the Medrash, what is the repetition here? What is the difference between he was afraid, he was distressed? Why does the Torah use those 2 words? So Rashi says a fascinating thing. Listen to this. Yaakov is afraid lest he be killed. Esau will kill him. And even though God made a promise to Yaakov, but Rashi explains, the Gemara explains in Maseches Brachos, that because of Yaakov's humility, he thinks his sins will make him unworthy. So Yaakov has this fear of his sins. So first thing Yaakov is afraid of is, perhaps he will kill. The second thing Yaakov is afraid of is, perhaps he will kill. Yaakov is afraid of 2 things. He's afraid that Esau will kill him, and he's afraid that he may kill Esau. Now you may wonder, What's that to be afraid of? I mean, if he's able to vanquish his enemy and destroy his enemy, that should be a good thing. You could even imagine that he's praying he'll be able to do that. And yet we find that the same way Yaakov was afraid that he would be killed, Yaakov is afraid that he might become a killer. And here you see a very, very important idea, which is actually very relevant to the military situation that we're in. And that is, Judaism is not pacifist. The halacha is very clear that if somebody is coming to destroy you, you destroy them first. We don't turn the other cheek. If an enemy tries to kill us, we fight back. But we don't have joy in it. We don't have simcha in it. We recognize that whenever we have to engage in violence, even when it's necessary, it can affect us in negative ways. It can make us less sensitive to human suffering. It can make us cruel. It can make us callous. The characteristic of a Jewish person is rachamim, compassion. Gomlei chesed, to do chesed. And violence, even when it is justifiable and even when it is required, can often corrupt a person in all sorts of difficult ways. So Yaakov is praying to Hashem, not only that he not be the victim, but he's praying to Hashem that he not be the perpetrator as well, because that could have a very negative impact on character. You need special siyata d'shmaya, that you don't become corrupted by what you need to do to other people, even when it's necessary. Again, I'm not suggesting pacifism. We are obligated to wage war against enemies that try to destroy us. But it does remind us that we never take glee, just like in Mitzrayim, right, by the splitting of the Red Sea, when the Egyptians were drowning and the angels in heaven wanted to sing a song of praise to God. So what did God say? God said, my creatures are drowning. My creatures, who are my creatures? The Egyptians are drowning in the sea. It is not a time to rejoice. Now, God didn't say, oh, the Egyptians are my creatures, so I'm going to save them. No, God said they have to die. But we don't have joy about that. Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, and this is the pasuk the Medrash quotes on the story of Kriyas Yamsuf, do not rejoice upon the downfall of your enemy. See, I remember seeing pictures in the New York Times years ago after a terrorist bombing that killed, men, women, children, that some guy, some terrorist, dipped his hands in the blood of the victims and was dancing around like a crazy person with blood dripping from his fingers, besimcha. And all I can say is, unless a Jew was seriously mentally ill, this is not how a Jew responds. This is not how Baruch Hashem our Chayolim respond. And in that sense, we have a lot to be proud of for the IDF, because not only do we have, Baruch Hashem, a great army that can really carry out missions, but we have a moral army. And this is even those who are not religious, the culture. And it comes from Torah, it comes from Yiddishkeit ultimately, because Torah is so ingrained in our spiritual DNA that even people who have not been religious for generations still have a residual sense of holiness. Call that the Pintel Yid, the spark within the Jew. And, the IRS does not the IRS, that's another word. The IDF does not celebrate or rejoice upon what they need to do. They do it because they have to do it. They don't do it because they want to do it. And as a result, the IDF has been criticized for putting their own soldiers at risk, because instead of aerial bombings, they'll often go house to house. They'll give warnings. I mean, who gives warnings to terrorists? Say, please get out of the area because we're going to be... I mean, you give a warning to the guy that's going to kill you the next day? Sinwar, who, Baruch Hashem, is not in the world anymore. But you know, he was under Israeli custody years ago, and he even needed brain surgery. And he got brain surgery, and then he gets released in a hostage exchange deal to get back, I don't know if it was Gilad Shalit or another situation. And then a few years later, he orchestrates October 7th. So maybe we're crazy. And, you know, maybe these are very wrong decisions. I'm not endorsing the decisions. But they do come from a place of sensitivity and compassion and rachamim. And on that level, I can be proud of even the wrong-headed decisions that we make. And indeed, some of those decisions were wrong. I mean, we're putting our own chayolim at risk with all sorts of things. But it does highlight the idea that Yaakov is expressing, that the same way I'm afraid to be murdered, I'm afraid to be a murderer. A Jew tries to avoid that because it affects you one way or the other. Now, the final point is that the end of Yaakov's prayer is, he says to God, save me from my brother, save me from Esau. Hatzileni na miyad achi, miyad Esau. Now the question is obvious. Yaakov only has one brother, his twin. So what's the repetition? Save me from Esau, save me from my brother. So the Beis HaLevi offers a very, very famous pshat. Maybe you've heard it, but it's very worthwhile remembering. He says, Yaakov, besides the fear of killing or being killed that we alluded to above, Yaakov has two other fears, meaning he's afraid that Esau will try to destroy him, but then he's afraid of the Esau that comes with friendship and brotherhood, meaning save me from the Esau who will destroy me, and save me from the Esau who comes as a friendly brother. Because one Esau is going to destroy my body, and the other Esau is going to destroy my soul. And the Beis HaLevi points out that, you know, we think the only danger we face among the Umot HaOlam is when they try to destroy us. But when they're friendly and open, that's wonderful. In reality, the friendship is a hidden trap, assimilation, intermarriage, right? In other words, when Napoleon invaded Russia, so life for the Jews in Russia was absolutely awful under the Tsars. Oppressive, awful, awful, awful life. Now Napoleon promised, and in fact he delivered, on emancipating the Jews, collapsing the ghettos, giving them access to universities, giving them political and social and economic rights. He could make their life so much better. So there was a machlokas among the Gedolim in Europe. Should we daven for Napoleon's victory over the Tsar? Some rabbis said yes. Life under the Tsars is intolerable. But the one major exception was the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman, who felt we'll do better under the Tsar than under Napoleon, because if the Tsar is crushing our bodies, emancipation will destroy our neshamas. And therefore, you know, he actually wanted, of course, his tefillos were answered. As you know, Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon was not able to conquer Russia. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe said many years later, it's easier to be a Jew in Siberia than suburbia. Siberia, very, very hard. People die. But you know you're a Jew. You can't escape that fact. Precisely when life is comfortable and you have all the options, it may be very much harder to be a Jew there. Because who's forcing you? There's no pressure. You know, one of the words for someone who converts is a Jew by choice. Maybe you've heard. It's a modern term. I'm not a Jew by birth, I'm a Jew by choice. That's a term that we use, or that is used for Gerim. But the truth of the matter is, in this day and age, every person is a Jew by choice, because even if you're a Jew by birth, no one's forcing you to be Jewish. You can be whatever you want. I mean, not in God's book. I don't mean you're allowed to be whatever you want, but de facto, you can be whatever you want. So, if you decide in a world that has unlimited options that I want to be connected to Hashem, I want to keep the Torah, you are making a choice. It's a choice. And that choice is much more difficult when things are good than when things are bad. Because when anti-Semites create a society where Jews have no way out, so they're kind of stuck with being Jews. And therefore Yaakov is praying to Hashem, deliver me not only from the Esau that tries to physically destroy me, but deliver me from the Esau that comes as my brother, brotherhood, friendship, because that's going to be a big danger to our neshama. And once again, Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. What happened to our Avos is exactly what we think about in terms of our relationship. So there are societies of persecution, and there are societies of openness, but the open societies could even be more dangerous than the societies of persecution. Okay, so we'll stop here and have a good Shabbos, a good week.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.